You've heard it said that variety is the spice of life. That is true. It's also true that spices are the variety of your food storage. Let's go ahead and talk about it. Do-do-do, do-do-do, vegan prepper. Do-do-do, do-do-do, vegan prepper. So most of you know that I advocate kind of a bare bones prepping style. We prep mostly dry goods, beans and grains. Obviously we are vegan, so those are the things that we stock. And it's funny too when people say like, oh, it's so great to find a vegan prepping channel. Like really almost all of the shelf stable foods are vegan. Like they're really easily accessible ones, I will say, because obviously you can have freeze dried versions of other foods that are much more expensive that still have a long shelf life, but they're hugely expensive and hard to access. And so really some of the simplest things that you can stock are beans and rice. And so that's kind of how we do it around here. I famously say, not that I'm that famous, but something that I say a lot too is that, you also hear in the prepper community that we need to store what we eat and eat what we store. And I think it's actually far more important for us to acclimate ourselves to eating what we store rather than so much storing what we eat. And I don't mean storing things that you don't normally eat. I mean potentially changing the form of how you store something and then learning to eat that way. I discussed that in one of my videos, The Habits of Prepping, where I kind of discuss how we transitioned over a couple of years from storing canned beans to storing dried beans and sort of some of the things that we discovered with that. But that's kind of one of the main examples that I can think of, is that obviously we're eating beans as a vegan family, but now we're no longer stocking canned beans, we're stocking dried beans. And in case anybody is concerned out there about power outages and our ability to cook our beans without power, we have also absolutely prepped all of that. We can cook anything and everything that we have on hand with no power whatsoever. I even have a test video on the channel where we did just that, and I'll link that down below too. I'll do the habits video and the off-grid bean cooking test that we did, utilizing some of the things that we have prepared for such an eventuality. But all of that to be said, if you can acclimate yourself in daily life to eating the things that are more long-term storage friendly, so that then your preps can become your everyday food. So it's no longer so much that you have to separate even your preps from what you eat every single day. And that is, I think, a great place to be in. So for me personally, all of these buckets here are just like my daily pantry items, but my preps are all of these things in Mylar ready to refill these buckets as needed. And then when I refill, I purchase that thing again and then put that into Mylar to keep it safe, ready to kind of cycle in again. So anyway, that was free. I wasn't intending to talk about that. These always get longer than I think they will, but I think some of that is kind of important to explain. So when I say spices are your variety, that is basically what I mean. I feel like that's all the video needs to be. Probably you could figure some stuff out and go from there and have a lot of fun, but I will try to show you some of the things that I have picked up over time. It's also, I think, really important to think, especially if you kind of are more of an omnivore, or if you do eat meat, or really any style of eating. We eat basically legumes, grains, vegetables, and fruits, right? That is essentially, and nuts and seeds and stuff. That's essentially the bulk, just basically the bulk of what we eat. But for the most part, that's what a lot of people eat like. They eat in that style, maybe not those items, but people typically tend to repeat the same items over and over and over again. And even in a more omnivorous diet, say it's based on, chicken or beef, probably also with some vegetables, probably also with some grains, if you're not, like on a diet that completely gets rid of grains. And so, well, obviously, even if you were, you're probably not watching my channel, but if you're on a diet that completely gets rid of grains, even still, you have kind of repetition, right? So like my beans and rice becomes your chicken and rice, or, my chicken and rice soup, or your chicken and rice soup becomes my tofu and rice soup. And what changes the item that we cook from one dish to another dish is largely the spice content. What do we spice it? How do we spice it? What flavoring do you use? And that's how you change the bare bones of a dish from being an Indian dish, to being an Italian dish, to being a Mexican dish, to being a Chinese dish, to being almost anything you can think of. It's all in the spices. All right, I'm going to show you my bulk spice tote. I have 3 levels to my spice storage. Actually, there's usually 3 levels to almost all of my storage, but right now we're discussing the spices. And so my 3rd level tends to be the place where I keep the bulk overflow, which fills other containers, which then typically will fill even smaller containers, which I know sounds crazy, but just stick with me for a second. We're just going to be looking at level 3. This is the bulk overflow, and I want to show you a few things about purchasing your spices in larger quantities just so that you can be aware. Here is my primary bulk spice storage. This is a 13-gallon tote, if I am not mistaken. I'm pretty sure it's a 13-gallon tote. And this is where basically all of the bulk spices live, the ones that are basically waiting to be refills of my level 2 storage. So this is my level 3 storage, which I don't honestly think about it in these terms, but I feel like I have a need to kind of conceptualize it for the video, so that's how I'm going to talk about it. So basically, one thing I would like to say, well, for one thing, it's kind of obvious most of my spices I do get from Azure Standard. I have access to Azure Standard. They deliver to my area and I really love it. If you do not have access to Azure Standard, I would recommend seeing if you have like a Winco maybe, or a bulk food place in your area. Barring that, then Amazon is actually a great source for bulk spices. That is where I get bulk spices if I can't find them locally, or I mean, if I can't find them on Azure. I don't really have access to a lot of bulk spices locally, at least not nearly in the quantity that I like to purchase them in. So Amazon is, the source. And honestly, I know that there are people who have issues with Amazon, and that's fine. I personally try to shop other places, though I don't demonize Amazon. There's a lot of stuff that's not good about it, but it just is true that especially for people who live in, more remote areas, or if you live in a place where you can't get Azure, I think it's still better for you to purchase your bulk spices, instead of spending $5 on something like a little 1 or 2 ounce jar at the grocery store. You can purchase a pound of that same spice usually for close to $10. And that's obviously a better choice for you anyway. So anyway, barring that, let's go ahead and look at some of the logistical type stuff that I want to talk to you about really fast with purchasing spices, especially if you start purchasing them in larger quantities. For one thing, I would say make sure that you're, prepared to use them up. Don't let them languish. This is something that's constantly being worked through in my house. We work through a lot of spices in my house because we like our food extremely flavored. Also, we do live in a very dry climate, so I think some of the stuff may last a little longer for me than it does for other people. I have gotten, 2, even more than 2 years off of certain spices. They still smell really good, but it is possible that if you live in a more moist area, you might need to be a little more careful about your storage. So I do, like I said, I store them in these totes, so they're protected from light, but they're just kind of in their original packaging. Now, some of them, if you order from Azure, it's pretty handy. They will come in a Mylar bag. So if I were really being, persnickety and preppery about this, preppery, is that a word? I could just throw an oxygen absorber in here and seal this bag right up, because this is a Mylar bag. So sometimes you get lucky. A lot of their smaller stuff does not come like this, but sometimes it does. And I could make that time last for a really long time like that. So that is just definitely something to keep in mind. Again, for me, it's not as big of a deal. I'm protecting it from light, I'm protecting it from heat, and moisture is not a huge deal in my area. I live in central Arizona. So I have these spices here, and the thing, like I said, I keep wanting to show you guys is kind of a difference so that you don't get surprised. A lot of your spices, when you purchase a pound, they look like this. It's kind of a small bag, about a quart usually. About a pound will fit into a quart jar or a quart storage container. And so that is a lot of times what you find. But then, so like for instance here again, this is whole peppercorns. But when you purchase some of your bulkier, like your lighter spices, those will come in a much larger quantity. And so those, if you can't get through them very quickly, you may consider ordering more like a 4-ounce package, and it will still be quite a lot. So this is a 1-pound bag. It looks like it's in a 1-gallon Mylar bag. And then here, although we've used some of this, this is 1 pound of bay leaves. It's huge. Like, it's a really big, this is the biggest bag of spices I've ever purchased. Volume wise, but it is still only 1 pound. So the volume can change based upon how light the spice is. And so it's just something to keep in mind for your storage. Again, maybe 4 ounces of bay leaves would be better. I found we were still going through bay leaves kind of too quickly, even with the 4-ounce package. So I decided, let's go ahead and just move to the 1 pound bag. And that was bigger than even I expected, even though I've been doing this for a while, because it was the first time that I got bay leaves. But just so that you know, for your own storage, it can be, more than you expect. This is some nutmeg I bought long ago at a bulk section, and it still smells amazing, and I'm still using that for my baking. I clearly don't go through very much nutmeg, so when it comes time to replace this, I will probably only purchase about 4 ounces of nutmeg. It's just not something that we use very often. I'm not John Townsend. We just sort of don't use it as much. I also like to purchase most of my spices, if it's reasonable to do so, in their whole form. For multiple reasons. Number one is they last longer in their whole form. One of the things that you have to consider when you're thinking about the longevity of pretty much all stored food, all stored goods, is oxygen, which is why one of the primary things for storing anything long-term is sticking an oxygen absorber into something to remove oxygen to make that thing last longer. So the reason that a whole spice will last longer than a spice that is already ground is simply for that same, or for the principle of the fact that a ground spice is exposed more to oxygen than the same thing in its whole form, if that makes sense. If you take the whole piece and you grind it into a powder, every piece of that powder, all the sides of every piece of that powder is now exposed to oxygen, whereas when it remains in its whole form, it's less exposed to oxygen, and it will just simply last longer. So you'll end up with much fresher, wonderful flavor also if you're using your fresh ground spices. But I do want to also throw out a caution with that. If you are using your fresh ground spices in recipes, many times recipes are utilizing spices that are pre-ground, maybe sometimes older. So if you get to where you're using a large amount of your own freshly ground spices, you may need to dial back some of the spice in certain recipes, certain spices primarily. Things that come to mind immediately are things like cumin, coriander seed, anything that has like a really high volatile oil content. So pretty much anytime I see a teaspoon of cumin, I tend to only put like 3/4 of a teaspoon, and it's plenty flavorful enough for us because we grind all of our cumin fresh. And so the spices are more powerful when you grind them fresh. So that's just like a thought to keep in mind. But the other really great thing about it is that I no longer need to store bags of ground cumin and bags of whole cumin, for instance. I don't need to store ground pepper and whole pepper. I can buy just whole cumin seed, whole peppercorns, and that covers me for both ground and whole spices. And being a house that does quite a lot of cooking from India, like Indian cuisine in our house, because we're vegan. This is like if you are vegetarian or vegan, it's like Indian food is kind of where it's at for your variety. And again, most of that variety is created in the spices. But Indian cuisine uses a lot of whole spices, and they can use ground spices as well. And so being able to have that option, just purchasing one thing, is pretty great. Now, I haven't purchased whole nutmeg yet. I have considered that maybe the next time I purchase nutmeg, I'll actually buy it in its whole form. I haven't ever done that before. So if anybody has, or if anybody uses whole nutmeg that they grind for their recipes, like as they go, let me know how it goes. Like, let me know some of the logistics involved in that. Do I need to buy a special grater or what? Like, let me know in the comments. I have questions too, It's not all about you. Come on. I'm kidding. It is all about you. Let me show you now level 2 of my spice storage. And that is right here. So basically, anytime spices run out in my level 1, which is just like a regular spice rack, I refill those bottles from here. When I refill these bottles or these containers from and these are all quart size containers, by the way. So like this one's getting pretty low. But these are all quart size containers. And when I refill these from the packages that I have in the tote, if I run out of whatever is in the tote, that is when I order new stuff. And then I still have a full quart container in here. And then I end up with another bag in the tote so that I never run out of spices. I've shared before that it's extremely important to me now. I set up this whole system so that I never run out of spices. It's very important for me not to run out of spices. So I can share about that in just a second. But basically in my house, you know, in the prepping community, they say 2 is 1 and 1 is none. In my house, we say always replace the spare. And so by having kind of a mid-range, I always ensure that I have spare. And that's kind of how I work it in my house for most things that we have. To this point, everything that we have stored is still in its whole form. This is where I store ground and whole. So here's fresh ground cumin. Here's cumin seed. And then it ends up being super handy as well, because when I need to grind fresh cumin, one of this container, I just dump into my little dedicated spice grinder, and it puts out exactly as much as I need for the other container. And then I simply refill the whole spices in that jar, if that makes sense. So when I need to refill my black pepper, I'm gonna just take this one and dump it into the grinder because it's the perfect amount, and then get my black pepper, and then I'll just refill that with whole, and that is how that works in my kitchen. So that's sort of some of the logistics behind exactly how the whole spice thing works. And having whole and ground, so I don't have to grind it fresh every time I need it. I have some on hand, but this is as much, like one of these jars full is as much ground of the spice as I will have on hand at any given time. So I'm just grinding that much at a time, and otherwise everything for the most part is stored in its whole form. Since I mentioned that I was going to talk about it, I would just very briefly share the reason I'm kind of obsessed with making sure that I never run out of spices is because we went through some really kind of awfully lean times financially several years ago, and it was kind of the kind of times where you're walking into the grocery store literally with only $5 and trying to figure out how am I going to feed my family for this week. And so that began actually a lot of what became stocking like this, and my spices especially, the importance of it and making sure that I never run out, because of how important it is that you can take the plainest food, and if you just have seasonings, it can become, you know, a delicious feast, right? You can have the same food over and over and over again in a week, but if you just change the spices, you could change what you're eating from night to night. And so let me go ahead and also now show you the absolute most basic of basics of switching up cuisines from country to country. And obviously there could be more choices, but for me personally, I feel like as long as you have 6 basic spices or 6 basic flavors, including salt, obviously, or I'm not really including salt here, and definitely always make sure as a prepper, make sure you're prepping salt, okay? Get yourself another 5-pound tub of salt when you go to Costco or whatever, okay? I actually have already seen salt jump, and we have quite a lot on hand, but just make sure that you do get salt. It isn't only for salting your food, so even if you don't salt your food so much, for fermenting, a lot of times salt can be very important, and it can be important as a preservative for foods, you know, in situations that, you know, we might find ourselves in. But yeah, just make sure that you don't forget to prep salt. So I'm not including salt in this list, but that is definitely part of it. And there's going to be a couple of honorable mentions here, but for the most part, let me show you how you can switch between 4 different cuisines using only 6 spices. All right, so with these 6 spices, like especially if you haven't started stocking up at all, start here. I am by no means saying stop here. You saw how many different bottles I had over in my level 1 spice storage. We used a lot of spices at this house. But to sort of just get yourself started and to see, you know, how much variety you can create from such a simple array of spices, I really want to go ahead and take a look at this. So this is basically how I do it for us, with maybe a few additional things, and I'll kind of discuss that as we go. So the 6 basic flavors are, and I say flavors because I do have onion, like minced onion here, but obviously you could just use onions that you chop up and throw into your dish. So this is garlic. Also, you could do the same with the garlic. You could do the same thing with ginger, fresh basil, fresh oregano, you know, but we basically have garlic, onion, ginger, cumin, basil, and oregano. You can make dishes that are Indian, Italian, Mexican, or Chinese using these spices. And let me show you exactly what that looks like. So for Indian, you would be using garlic, onion, ginger, cumin, and basil. You can forget the oregano for that. These flavors would make a dish that's more Indian. Now, obviously, Indians are hugely famous for the variety of their spices. And again, this is not an exhaustive list. This is just to get you started. An honorable mention here would be cinnamon. If you add a little touch of cinnamon, all of a sudden, there you have, you know, a curry. You have a delicious flavor that is not something that you typically find in more Western food. Cilantro is another one that I want to mention as a garnish. Leaf, cilantro leaf, or coriander leaf, depending on where you are in the world. And as a quick note for coriander, in the US, we distinguish between the leaf and the seed of the same plant by calling it cilantro or coriander. So when in the US you hear cilantro, that's the leaf. If you hear coriander, that's the seed. Whereas if you go over across the pond, as they say, to Britain, coriander is the name of both of them. Sometimes you'll see a differentiation. Sometimes you'll see the recipe will state coriander leaf. Sometimes you will see the recipe will state coriander seed. Very often they will not. So if it's calling for a half cup of coriander in a recipe, that is usually a hint that it doesn't mean the seed, it means the leaf. And I don't mean to be overly simplistic here. I just want to explain that for anybody who is new to cooking or new to looking at recipes, especially if you happen to be looking at international recipes, to keep in mind that we have different names for that particular spice depending on where we are in the world. I'm talking about coriander leaf, cilantro. See, I just did it myself. But cilantro as a garnish towards the end, but then also in Indian cooking, you'll find yourself using coriander seed as a whole spice and as a powder. So yeah, this is much more complex than just this, but just keep in mind, if all you have is these 6 spices, these 5 can give you a really beautifully Indian tasting dish, as well as just with a little touch of cinnamon, and all of a sudden, yeah, you just have an amazing Indian dish. For more Italian cooking, you would be using garlic, onion, and the basil and oregano. So you can have, a beautiful Italian dish. For me personally, we take the oregano out because I am not an oregano fan. I do like basil, but I really don't like oregano. Most of my Italian dishes will be garlic, onion, and basil with no oregano. But anyway, if you like that flavor, then go ahead and add that in, and now you have yourself an Italian dish. For a more Mexican flavored dish, you would use garlic, onion, cumin, and oregano. So this is my exception to the oregano rule, actually, especially like when I make my chili, for instance. A lot of times oregano is the spice that you want to throw in, and that kind of rounds everything else out more beautifully, and then you end up with a kind of distinctly Mexican tasting dish, and it's delicious. Also, as an honorable mention here, again, cilantro, the leaf, oftentimes towards the end as a garnish, and then, lime juice, things like that. That can be another really great thing. Actually, lime juice for Indian food too, but I don't mean to go forever. I could talk forever about this stuff. I'm trying to keep it really simple. And I also do deeply apologize if anybody feels that I'm oversimplifying the culture of their food cuisine. I'm not trying to say that this is all there is. Each one of these cultures has its own beautifully rich and complex food cuisine, but this is just to sort of get us started, and also to sort of see what can we start focusing on as far as storage goes for creating the cuisine of these different wonderful cultures, to sort of just begin to whet the appetite, as it were. So for more Chinese flavors, we could start with garlic, onion, and ginger, and that's basically what you would use. Especially if you used green onion instead of regular onion, you could end up with some really wonderful dishes. And especially, I would say, if you enjoy Chinese food or Chinese takeout cuisine, whatever, make sure that you get yourself some soy sauce. Soy sauce is kind of a forever food. It has a really long shelf life, and then you can base so many sauces, so many different kinds of sauces, just starting with soy sauce, depending on how much soy sauce you use compared to water and vinegar and orange juice, or sugar and chili paste. And you can make a million different sauces just from soy sauce. So if you enjoy Chinese food, get yourself some soy sauce as well, in addition to just simply usually a base of ginger, garlic, and onion, especially if you can get green onion. But if you can't get green onion, or you don't have that right now, then onion, just like regular onion, can kind of work. I'll also say tomato paste. I don't know if any of you were waiting for it. I don't know, some people might think an unhealthy obsession with tomato paste, but for me personally, I think it's perfectly healthy, because tomato paste is so versatile. So many cuisines in the world base a lot of their dishes on tomatoes. In fact, Indian, Italian, and Mexican cuisine, if you have tomato paste, you can make a base of tomatoes for like almost anything, right? Pasta sauce or curries, or like red enchilada sauce you would make with your tomato paste, or like all kinds of things. And so I think tomato paste is just an excellent thing to have on hand, also for creating some of that, some of the bases of those different cuisines. I also would like to point out that all four of those, with the exception of maybe the Italian, all four, so I guess I should say three of the four, Indian, Mexican, and Chinese, you can basically make almost anything based in beans and rice. So from one night to the next, you can switch even the kind of cuisine you're having just because you switched the spices. Now, if you trade the rice for some pasta, well then there you go. You've got an Italian meal instead, with the spices. But then even like, so it's not a bad idea to stock up on noodles, because with noodles, even then you can go into Japanese cuisine, right? You can make some ramen. You can make, you can make noodle dishes, Chinese noodle dishes. You can make Italian pasta dishes. So there's so many different things. Now, obviously there's differences in the type of noodle, and even that, like, I'm getting way far beyond kind of, but this is just sort of to kind of get you guys thinking and do some of your own research. But honestly, and again, I apologize, I'm not meaning to oversimplify anybody's culture. I understand that these things are not the same, what I'm about to say. But so for instance, if all you have is spaghetti noodles on hand, you can make ramen with the spices, even though the noodles are not the same as the noodles that are typically served with ramen. But it's like, you can still do it. Like, you can cook the spaghetti and then put it in a broth instead of putting in a tomato sauce. Like, you can decide to have the variety based upon your kind of very simple storage, unless you would like to store spaghetti and ramen and, whatever. Actually, we end up storing all the different kinds of noodles because we are kind of really interested in all of these dishes and kind of their authentic experience, as authentic as we can be being vegan. But I just want to point that out. Like, there's so many different possibilities. You can use one kind of noodle in a lot of different ways. So anyway, and then also, gosh, your storage of flour, where you could make tortillas, or you could make naan, or you could make a bread to go with your pasta, or there's just like, you can start like seeing how even some of your simplest ingredients, if you just sort of think about different cultures, like for those of you who say that you're not very creative in coming up with your meals, as long as you have certain spices on hand, you can make almost anything. But just begin to think about, what do other cultures typically, or cultures different from your own, typically create from these very simple ingredients. And that is something that is common across cultures across the world, is a lot of what would be considered kind of the simple food, the peasant food, I guess, as it were, is so varied because of the flavorings. But honestly, when you look at it, it's like, gosh, we're all so much the same. Like, and I think, I'm kicking my thing here. And I think that's one of the things, and I don't mean to get teary-eyed, that is so beautiful, especially in this world being so divided right now. And for me personally too, it's like, the more I learn about other cultures and the way that they live and the way that they do things, even to preparing their food, there's something so universal about the experience of food preparation and the simple ingredients and what people did with it. It ends up being so similar, whether you have naan or roti in India or tortillas in Mexico. It all ends up being so similar. And I just think it's like kind of cool to see that really basically at our heart, we are all the same. So guys got me all emotional. It is time to cut this video short, and I hear you, Kathy. It's too late to cut it short. It is long past the time that you would cut it short, but we're cutting it short now, and hopefully that was helpful. And I feel like it was so random, but there's so much information there, and I tried really hard to focus it. And hopefully, if any of you have questions or you want me to get into more detail on any of the stuff that I kind of started to share, please let me know in the comments down below. If you have your own suggestions or your own thoughts on any of this, again, let me know in the comments down below. I don't know if you guys realize what a gold mine the comments sections of my videos have become. The more viewers we get, the more wisdom and just incredible experience we draw from all over the place. And I love reading your comments. I learned so much from all of you. I especially love hearing your experiences that you share so beautifully. So seriously, take time to read through the comments. Actually, there's part of me, oh my gosh, I'm terrible at this, but seriously, I almost would say, like, if you don't have time to watch the video, still click on it and go read the comments. Like, don't even watch my videos, just read the comments. Please watch my videos. Okay, as always, I hope the rest of your day is good and your life stays wonderful. See you guys later. Bye. As a little girl, I got to experience, because my biggest chunk, I'm kind of a mutt, like many Americans are, but my biggest chunk is Polish. And as a little girl, I got to experience making pierogi for one of our family gatherings in a big circle of the women of my family. And it was an amazingly beautiful experience. Everybody sitting around, grabbing the filling, putting it into the dough, folding it over, creating those beautiful little half moon dumplings, very similar to some Chinese dumplings actually, and just creating that in a circle of women getting ready for a holiday. And I got to experience, and I've seen it in TV too, like in movies and TV. It seems like kind of a universal experience, right? Of kind of back in the day of women sitting around in a circle as a community creating things for holidays. And I got to experience something similar with one of my best friends, my godson's mom. She's actually been on the channel before. She's Dominican. And so we sat around, her husband is Mexican. We sat around, and so, because I'm not sure if tamales are a Dominican food. Now I feel really embarrassed that I don't know that. But we sat around for her Christmas party one year making the tamales. So she had me and my two sons over, and we all sat around in a circle around a table doing the process for creating all of the tamales for the big Christmas party that year. And it was such an amazing experience. And yeah, it totally reminded me of making the pierogi with my family and experiencing that same thing. And again, it's just so universal, like a filling in a dough. And even with tamale, it's a little different, right? Because it's like a masa, but still it's essentially like a filled little thing. And I think pretty much every culture on earth, no matter where you're from, no matter where you are, you have some sort of permutation of that basic stuffed thing, some kind of dough, if it's a masa or if it's, some fried thing or like a rice paper or whatever. I just think, so anyway, like I said, like just thinking about that, like that experience was so similar to what I experienced, even though it's a completely different culture. The experience was the same. We are all basically the same. I just think there's a beautiful universal quality to food preparation and culture. And I just think it's something that can kind of bring people together. And I don't know, I'm a prepper. So is it weird? I'm a prepper, but I live in kind of this idealized space in my head. I still have a lot of hope that, we can figure things out. I think we all get so disconnected from these basics. And if we could just get more connected, we would figure out still how connected we all are as individuals, as humans. Anyway, that's it. That's actually it.